Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psychedelic Insights. Today, Adam and I have the pleasure of interviewing DiNardo, CEO of Mindstate Design Labs. How are you doing today, Dylan?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's get this rolling right now. Can you give us some background information on yourself and what led you to creating Mindstate Design Labs? What is the mission of Mindstate Design Labs?
Well, my background is in biotech VC. So I worked both in investments and operations across a pretty wide variety of treatment modalities and disease indications. I had a bit of a focus on deep tech and frontier tech applications like gene and cell therapy. But I left biotech VC because to me, there was really just one question that was the most interesting question in all of science. And that is that basically different psychedelics have different pharmacology and they also have very different effects on consciousness. So if we can map out the pharmacology of all these different psychedelic drugs and relate that pharmacology to the distinct changes in consciousness that each drug induces, then we have this sort of map for the biological basis of consciousness. And that's the mission of Mindstate Design Labs, to map the biological basis of the varieties of psychedelic experience so that in the short term, at least, we can more reliably induce specific varieties of experience, those changes to consciousness, to mood, awareness, sense of self, sense of time, all these other constructs of perception, those changes that are going to have the therapeutic impact. So we want to do that more reliably and more consistently. So that's how Mindstate Design Labs came about. I teamed up with Dr. Tom Ray. He's our scientific founder. And I was looking for the research that was doing this connection of phenomenology to pharmacology. And I think what Tom has been doing for some time really provides the basis for us to really solve this problem.
That's awesome. And yeah, what Mindstate Design Labs is doing is extremely innovative, and I'm glad that we have you on to explain more about what the company is doing exactly, because it seems like it's very novel, and not many other companies, maybe if any, are doing exactly what you're doing. So you talked about mapping out states of consciousness. That brings me to the question: can you tell us about the Osmanthus platform? Can you explain to us how Mindstate is creating novel psychedelic compounds? And lastly, what are primers and probes?
Sure. You may have to remind me of some of those.
Yeah,
But to
sorry, that's a
start with
loaded question.
no, that's all right. To start with Osmanthus. So Osmanthus is a predictive platform for the design of altered states of consciousness. And it's based on two fundamental types of data. The first is human experience. You're probably familiar with the Shulgins. They're known as the godparents of psychedelics. They created most psychedelics that exist in the world today. And they published both the syntheses of these compounds as well as their personal experiences. And because of them, many psychedelics, not just the few that are commonly known, but hundreds of psychedelics have been in use in underground settings for decades now. And so we have human experience with all of these different types of compounds. And that's very unusual in any area of medicine or biotech, to have all this human experience before you're actually developing the drug. So we have it at this point, over 70,000 human reports across these hundreds of psychedelic drugs in our database. And so that serves as really part of the grounding for the platform. The other piece of the platform is then the pharmacology. So every psychedelic has a different pattern of engagement with the brain. So most of our data at the moment is based on affinity assays. We look at how each psychedelic engages with each receptor or each site in the brain, and to what extent does the psychedelic engage with each of those targets. And there's a different pattern for every drug. And so what we're doing is this pattern matching between those pharmacological profiles of the drug and the phenomenology of the drug, the human experience. So do people commonly report, say, a sense of reverence or awe on this particular drug, or this particular group of drugs? And what is it about those drugs pharmacologically that they have in common that other drugs that don't produce awe do not then have? So it's this mixing and matching of the pharmacology and the relation quantitatively to to both sides of that, the phenomenology and the pharmacology. And so natural language processing plays a big part in the quantification and the validation here. Recently, due to progress in natural language processing and OpenAI and Da Vinci in particular, we've seen this vast improvement in the quantitative representation of semantics, right? And language encodes those dimensions of semantics. Language has more information per bit than any other data on human experience. So if you think about all of human language, you have this multidimensional space that can now be quantified that represents all of human experience. And psychedelics provide the ability to very specifically target how different changes in combinations and ratios of neurotransmitter receptors result in different changes to conscious experience. Again, sense of self, sense of time, attention, awareness, all these constructs. So using NLP provides us with that quantitative grounding to represent human experience and really tease out the role of pharmacology versus the role of set and setting. So of course, if you take psilocybin, you're going to have pretty different experiences at different times, and different individuals will have different experiences. So there's going to be variation in individual physiology. There's going to be variation in the set, the mindset. So the attitudes and expectations and intentions and vulnerabilities, what we all just bring to any experience, that's going to impact what happens. And then the set, of course. So the both the physical location, but also the cultural and the social environment in which the experience takes place. So what we're doing is extracting out how the pharmacology of these drugs, separate from set and setting, leads to these different types of changes in conscious awareness. So that's the platform. So we're using that platform to create new drugs, right? So that's the commercial application here. And so the one way to use such a platform is basically to screen NCEs, new chemical entities. So to look at possible structures for new drugs and model out how those drugs engage different neurotransmitter receptors and therefore model out how those drugs are likely to change human consciousness. But for the moment, what we're using is what we call this primer probe method. And the idea here is that if you have one drug, it's very difficult to design a single drug that is engaging exactly the neurotransmitter receptors that you want to engage at exactly the right levels and not engage with other neurotransmitter receptors that you don't want to engage. So in order to get more selectivity about the combinations of neurotransmitter receptors that we're engaging, we're using this basically two molecule approach. So we take one compound that's psychedelic and that's fairly selective for 5-HT2A, the serotonin subtype that's kind of the parametic psychedelic receptor. Then we take another drug that on its own may not be psychedelic, may not even be psychoactive at normal levels, but that when combined with a psychedelic modulates the nature of the changes to mood and cognition, to the psychedelic subjective experience. And so we're using osmanthus then to look for and to validate those combinations and connect those combinations and the pharmacology that they engage to specific changes in consciousness. So I think, did I cover your three questions there?
You covered everything. That was great. You covered everything. And I'd like to quickly ask here, I know it's early on, maybe you can't share this information now, but are all the primers that you're looking at 5-HT2A agonists right now?
So not necessarily. So our lead primer is, but we're looking at each primer is an individual product line, right? Because each primer can be combined with multiple probes.
Okay.
But you could think of a primer as basically any drug that is psychedelic on its own.
Okay.
So we can look at 5-HT2A. There are some psychedelics such as 5-MeO-DMT that appear to be the experience appears to be largely driven by other neurotransmitter receptors. There are of course, ketamine and ibogaine, MDMA, other sites that result in psychedelic experience as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And at this time, what can you tell us about Mindstate's lead candidate currently undergoing IND enabling studies?
Well, we haven't disclosed the identity of the compound, but it's selected for 5-HT2A. So it's a psychedelic compound. it's the duration of action is relatively limited. It's a relatively short duration of the experience compared with many of the other drugs that are selective for 5-HT2A. And that's important from a commercial perspective. So you don't want patients tripping for 20 plus hours at a time. You don't want to incur the cost and pass on the cost to the patient of having a therapist sit there for 20 plus hours. So the short duration of action is very important. And the phenomenological profile of the drug is intentionally relatively bland. So it's kind of this psychedelic tofu where it tends to take on the character of whatever else is co-administered. And other drugs have this reputation as psychedelic tofu as well. But that's exactly what we were looking for. We wanted a drug that on its own, it is psychedelic. It does lead to some of the prototypical psychedelic changes, both to mood, to visual perception, tactile perception, and other things. But the generalized level of intensity is relatively low. And that's exactly what we wanted, sort of a blank canvas on which to paint other pharmacologies to very specifically target the state of consciousness and the relevant neurotransmitters and the relevant neural networks in the brain that are being stimulated.
Great. So again, coming back to mapping out states of consciousness, I feel, I am subscribed to Josie Kins. I know she works at Mindstate Design Labs. I mean, her videos showing the different levels of the psychedelic experience, visually just incredible. I don't know how she makes those. The way she's able to describe different psychedelic states, she uses just the perfect wording. She has so much knowledge on this topic. Can you explain what value she brings to Mindstate, and what's her job title at Mindstate? What exactly does she do at Mindstate?
Yeah, Josie is amazing, and it was difficult to come up with a job title, so we kind of went with the generic project manager. So we all work on projects, so that worked. But yeah, she has a very unique skill set. So she's the founder of psychonautwiki.org, maybe the biggest sort of psychedelic information sites. I know they had 1 million plus monthly visitors at some point. So there was psychonautwiki.org. There was also the replications subreddit. So that has 130,000 something subscribers. But this replications concept is, like it sounds, just replicating psychedelic experience. So the point is not necessarily an artistic interpretation. It's not necessarily trying to evoke emotions or communicate something intangible the way that other forms of art might be. The purpose is to faithfully represent exactly what it's like to have a certain psychedelic experience. And so Josie is the founder of that subreddit and really manages that community. She's launched the careers of multiple visionary artists, but she doesn't do the art herself at this point. I think the technology is it's pretty advanced to be able to do these different things. But the reason we recruited Josie is because she her central obsession is in articulating and documenting psychedelic experience and categorizing these experiences. So it's very difficult to talk about what's happening when your sense of self or your sense of time or some other construct of perception is functioning in a fundamentally different manner from normal waking consciousness. And you always hear people saying that I had this experience and it was ineffable. I can't possibly talk about it. It was unenglishable, right? We would challenge that. I don't think these things are inherently ineffable. It's just that language mostly evolved within the scope of normal waking consciousness. So you have to work a little bit harder in order to be able to English these things, to talk about these things. What's required for that is probably some degree of repetition of specific subsets of experience. It's some degree of I don't know, just obsession and intelligence. And Josie's just been working on this very important area for a long time. And the many different ways in which that adds value. One of the big ones is in the training of our models, right? So there's this concept of reinforcement learning through human feedback. So this is in natural language processing. term. But basically, when you have the machine spit out an answer, you need a human to look at that answer and see if it's correct, right? So Josie has spent all of this time reading these trip reports, and she does manually go through thousands of trip reports and manually label, here's where the person is talking about this particular type of visual distortion called visual stretching, or this is specifically when the person is talking about the emotion of ecstasy as distinct from euphoria, or what have you. And so this domain expertise to be able to look at trip reports and really subdivide the categories is something that's hugely valuable. And there's one video she did. I believe she looked at the glossary of psychedelic effects from a website called DMT Nexus, which is it's a very metaphorical and fanciful interpretation of all these things that happen in the DMT space. So watch that sometime, and you'll see how she can take these I don't know, these fantastic metaphors and these drug-induced ravings and say, okay, that goes in that category, that goes in that category. And that's a skill set that she shares with Tom as well. So our founder, Tom Ray, has just spent the past 20 years really immersed in these trip reports. And that's really a fundamental value of our company. We value the perspective and the experience of the psychonaut and the exploration that people have done, the explorations of consciousness, because that's produced all of this data that we can now pump into our system and use to really quantify and predict and model states of consciousness and their pharmacological basis.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, she's incredible. I try to watch her videos as much as possible. I imagine in the next couple of years, her channel will have millions of subscribers. But that's so cool that I remember when I found out that she actually worked for Mindstate, I had to learn more about what she does. So it's great to be able to ask you about that. Adam, I'm going to pass it off to you here now.
All right. Thank you very much. So this is a question based on what you guys mentioned early on in terms of mapping the consciousness in regards to different psychedelics and where it gets to. Is this also something that gets separated by the dosage that the person is doing too? Because different dosages can yield different states of consciousness, obviously. So is there a distinction made there as well?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's pretty much a standard convention when you're entering a trip report into one of these websites, whether it's Arrowhead or Blue Light or Reddit forums or so forth. Typically, people talk about the doses, and of course, it's raw, unstructured information for the most part. It's self-reported, and so you're going to get plenty of variability, but yeah, it does give you the ability to model in the dose, and of course that vastly impacts the experience.
All right, thank you. So Mindstate is creating drugs that may alter consciousness in ways never experienced by humans before. Will new models of psychedelic assisted therapy, psychological support be needed for these novel drugs in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, we are designing mind states that don't exist yet. So psychedelics, the psychedelics that we know about, the ones that we've assayed, the ones that are popular, that are just commonly known, hit a certain subset of sites in the brain. But there are many other sites in the brain that you could potentially interact with. So when you separate out an individual psychedelic molecule into a primer and a probe, suddenly that gives you the ability to access the entire pharmacopoeia. So whatever's in your medicine cabinet, whatever is a prescription drug, the essential oils, all these kinds of compounds are interacting with the brain in different ways. And so being able to mix and match gives us the ability to then potentially design states of consciousness that no single psychedelic can induce. We kind of it's somewhat of a pervasive assumption within the psychedelic industry that there are 7 or so existing psychedelics that define the scope of human experience, but those are just the drugs that kind of that exist, that are just lying around by the vicissitudes of history. Either they were used by indigenous societies or Hoffman happened to discover them, but really it's those drugs do not define the scope of possible conscious experience. And so the exploration of the entire state space of conscious experience, I think, has barely begun. So as we step into that, and as we try these drug combinations and see that they're altering consciousness in a way that's maybe fundamentally different from psilocybin or LSD or DMT or the drugs that we know about, yeah, it could certainly lead to different models of therapy here. I think the models in general fall into two very broad categories. There's the category where you kind of deliver a dose that is sufficient to induce a very profound experience. You provide eye shades, you provide the headphones to block out all environmental sounds and deliver music that's specially designed to be introspective. And so it's kind of a stepping back where the therapist is mostly there as a grounding force and as a support. And so you see things like I think some of the Hopkins studies with psilocybin, for example, are like that. So that's kind of one model. Another model is more of the MDMA MAPS model, where it's much more interactive. It's not a drug that sends the patient beyond the veil, so to speak. They still have maintained their contact with reality. They're still functional, but in a different state of consciousness. And so that's more of a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy model, where the back and forth with the therapist is really essential. So those are the two broad models. There's certainly many variations on those, and it's interesting to think about how those models might be varied for different states of consciousness. I think for the intense beyond the veil psychedelic dosages, there's not a lot of room to iterate on the model, but I think when you're talking about the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that could very much change. So I do think that the future of psychedelic therapy will and should very much be based on the incorporation of therapeutic approaches that already have great clinical validation. So not just maybe using the types of therapy that underground therapists have traditionally been using with psychedelics, but using those therapeutic approaches that are well validated apart from psychedelics, and then using that state of consciousness, that very specifically induced state of consciousness to optimize for that particular type of therapy, whatever it is. So I think that's probably how we'll end up iterating on the therapeutic models.
So I've done good amount of reading on psychedelic therapy. I still want to learn a lot more over the next months and years. I'm hearing that, in Europe, traditionally what was used was psycholytic therapy. So it was, I guess, multiple low dose sessions, and I guess the North American model is more macro doses. Would Mindstate be interested in looking at the more on the psycholytic side of things, of like low doses, or are you looking at macro doses for the most part for these drugs?
Well, personally, I'm just interested in everything. I'm interested in mapping out the entire space of possible conscious awareness. I think in the short term, our lead primer is going to be maybe somewhere in the middle, more on the side of the psycholytic therapy. So, maybe more towards the MDMA model,
Okay.
low to medium dose in the context of the serotonergic agonists like psilocybin.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks for the great response. Are there any specific first-gen psychedelic medicine trials you're interested in seeing the results of besides Compass's phase 3 and MAPS's phase 3?
Well, yes, all of them. So our challenge is that when you create a state of consciousness, you need to figure out how to do so reliably. But then you need to learn how to apply that state of consciousness. And so there are a few states that already have great clinical validation. So the obvious ones would be the entactogenic state, commonly associated with MDMA. So these overwhelming feelings of empathy, this ability to safely contemplate mental pain, looks like it's very effective for trauma-based disorders. So PTSD, certainly I anticipate other disorders will be applicable as well. But we've already been able to see in these sort of first generation legacy single molecule psychedelics, those states that they induce have particular therapeutic applications. There's then the, I'll call it the unitive oceanic boundlessness state. So the mystical experience as defined by the MEQ30, the general set of effects that are associated with psilocybin and LSD. So again, here we have great validation that this particular state of consciousness has a particular clinical application. And you know, there are a variety of clinical applications here. So we've seen, for example, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, a few others. And there are certain ways in which that general group of states of consciousness that are induced by LSD and psilocybin are applicable for those applications. So each time there's a new first generation psychedelic that makes it into humans, we get clinical data on what is it about that drug that induced the state of consciousness that resulted in the clinical outcomes. So if you look at psilocybin and the oceanic boundlessness state, for example, there are various studies showing the relationship between the occasioning of that mystical experience and the long-term treatment outcomes. And there's a very close statistical relationship. So generally speaking, if someone has the mystical experience, if boundaries dissolve, if there's some ego loss, that person does improve. Many people getting the same dose of psilocybin may not get that experience, and they tend not to improve. So it's in figuring out, okay, what is the experience? And then what are the subsections of that experience? So if you look at the MEQ30, that's the scale generally used to quantify and to track the oceanic boundlessness states, you have these sub-factors of the mystical experience. You have ineffability, you have, I think, sense of sacredness, you have the ego loss portion, you have positively felt mood. There are all these components, and you can track these components of the experience and see who experienced what. And this person experienced this feeling of awe. This person experienced the ego loss. The one who experienced the ego loss, their symptoms drastically improved. The one who experienced awe, maybe symptoms didn't improve as much. So the first generation psychedelics give us this map of which specific states of consciousness have which particular therapeutic outcomes. So as DMT and 5-MeO-DMT and ibogaine and ketamine and some of these other first generation psychedelics move through the clinical process, we'll get much better data on the specific experiences that induce specific therapeutic changes, and we'll design psychedelics that hopefully will more reliably induce those specific therapeutic experiences.
Dylan, are all of these clinical trials going on right now? Let's say, Compass, I don't know, Ty, just anyone. Are they using the scale? You said it's called the MEQ30?
Yes.
Are they all
mystical
using
experience
that?
questionnaire?
Are they all using that right now?
Probably most of them. Another one of the big scales is the ASC, the Altered State of Consciousness questionnaire, and there's an 11-dimensional version and a 5-dimensional version. So I'd say probably all of them are using the ASC in some form, and probably most of them are using the MEQ as well. There are a number of other scales and subscales that are used, but those are really the most popular ones.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
One interesting thing about the scales, and one thing that's very central to what we've been doing, is that these scales are intended to essentially reduce the state space of psychedelic experience into their commonalities, their lowest common denominators, right? Okay. So they're not designed to distinguish between experiences. And so as a result, you see some kind of funny study results where people will say, take DXM, dextromethorphan, and then psilocybin, and administer one of these scales and say, hey, look, there's no difference between the two. There's a candy flipping one as well. I think it's MDMA plus maybe it's psilocybin, maybe MDMA plus psilocybin versus psilocybin alone. Found no difference. So these scales are really not designed to be super precise, and they're not designed to distinguish among different states. Obviously, DXM induces a very different experience than psilocybin. Candy flipping experience, leads to a very different experience. But that's one of our major thrusts of our research is as we're mapping out the phenomenology, as we look at the data in the trip reports and the distribution of occurrence of different types of effects, and as we relate those effects to individual neurotransmitter receptors, we can then start to administer what's called a visual acuity scale. So just a very quick and dirty type of scale that says, this is an effect we think you might experience. To which extent did you have that particular effect? And from that, as we go through clinical trials, we can start to build out this mapping of the different kinds of effects that there are, and we can start to build better scales that are able to more accurately capture the nuances of the experience. So as an example, the 11D ASC, which is the most comprehensive psychedelic scale, has 2 visual categories. And we have, I think, 57 categories of visual effects at this point. So I think a huge aspect of being able to induce specific experiences and tell people, here's exactly what's going to happen, and to map the underlying pharmacology is being able to, again, make those breakthroughs in language to be able to subdivide these different aspects of the psychedelic experience so that we can map them out.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm understanding all this correctly, because I feel like this is a lot to digest in general. So when you're talking about the states of consciousness, it's just basically what molecule or whatever will yield what state of consciousness in general, or are there also different types of states of consciousness within, like, let's say, for example, like just shrooms in general, different states of consciousness within shrooms, whereas like the onset, whatever's happening at the peak, and then kind of whatever like that? Or is it, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly.
Yeah, that's a good question. So state of consciousness is just a cluster of effects, right? And it's kind of a nebulous category. We're familiar with normal waking consciousness, right? And you can have all kinds of different experiences just in normal waking consciousness, right? And there's dream consciousness, and you can have all sorts of states, within your dreams. And so psychedelic states are much the same way. An example I like to give is the example of NN DMT versus 5-MeO DMT. So NN DMT is very well known for inducing an experience where the patient goes into sort of a dream state. Their experience is one of being transported to a different place. There's a different landscape, a different room. They no longer have contact with reality. And that different place is very commonly, I think roughly 57% of the time, populated by entities. There are elves or angels or aliens or gods or something of that sort. So that's the DMT experience, and lots of very different things can happen when people dose DMT, depending on the dose, depending on their set and setting, all kinds of factors. But when you compare that entire scope of experiences under DMT to 5-MeO DMT, for example, you see these differences. So 5-MeO DMT is commonly this very intense ego loss kind of experience. There aren't usually alternate landscapes. There aren't usually entities. It's often this sort of formless void. All form and content dissolve. Sometimes there's the great white light that's also associated with near-death experiences. And it's not an absolutely clear boundary, right? So not everyone who takes DMT will experience entities. Not everyone who takes 5-MeO will have an ego loss experience. But there are these kind of silos of experience. There's a circle of experience with DMT. There's a circle of experience with 5-MeO. There's some overlap there, but there's also some areas where they don't overlap. So our work is to subdivide those aspects of experience to the finest degree possible, and then subgroup those fine degreed areas of experience into the individual states of consciousness that are related with particular pharmacology.
Okay, thank you. That I understand it much better, and I appreciate the explanation. It has been stated in many articles about Mindstate Design Labs that the company believes the psychedelic experience is central to treatment outcomes. What are your thoughts on non-hallucinogenic psychoplastogens?
Yeah, that's just sort of a fundamental assumption. Everything we do is based on the assumption that it's not just pharmacology. What's happening in the psychedelic experience is that the higher order brain structures are interacting with the environment in a way that fundamentally changes something, your perspective, your understanding of self, your view of yourself, your history, your environment, and that's what induces the change. So there's a famous psychedelic study where they asked people if the psychedelic experience was one of the top 5 most significant experiences in their life. And I think 80% of people said yes. And it was supposed to be comparable to, say, the death of a parent or the birth of a child. And so if you know, babies don't cause neuroplasticity, right? What causes, say, the change in behavior and the fact that that's the most significant event in your life is not that a baby was born sober. You know, you could have a baby and have no idea, and there's no neuroplasticity. It's the experience of you hold the baby in your arms and you say, wow, this is my blood, this is my DNA, and wow, I'm responsible for the welfare of this human being, right? It's the higher order brain structures interacting with the environment. And so I think when you look at psychedelics, the kinds of just really large efficacy signals that you're seeing, so 67% remission rate in treatment resistant PTSD for MDMA, I don't think you can get that via neuroplasticity. However, I do think it's a great strategy to see to what extent can you generate some of the biological changes that are involved with psychedelics, because the phenomenology has a role, the experience has a role, and the underlying biology of course, everything has a biological basis. So I think it's a great strategy, particularly because this is an area of biology that is so central to the brain and central to the mind, and research into this area has effectively been banned for decades. So it makes a lot of sense to take the new scientific tools that have been developed in the past few decades and apply them to purely the pharmacology. And I certainly wish those researchers and companies the best of luck. That would be incredible for patients if you can just send them home with a pill that leads to some significant improvement in their symptoms. And if you can beat SSRIs by just a couple points, then I do think that's a blockbuster drug. The approach did occur to me when I was first looking at the space, but I don't think it's reasonable to impute the efficacy that you're getting from psychedelic trials to these psychoplastogens. And to me, it's not as interesting. It's just, it's another drug. It's an SSRI alternative. What we're mostly interested in is not even the psychedelics themselves. It's using the psychedelics as tools to probe the chemical architecture of the mind. It's what these existing psychedelics reveal about the rendering of consciousness and the fundamental breakthroughs that could implicate in the areas of consciousness research and our experience of the world, potentially even in the design of new cognitive architectures for new AI. So I think the psychoplastogens, aren't getting to any of that, but I certainly wish everyone researching those the best of luck.
Thanks for the well thought out response. Do you believe that psychedelic therapy will one day become a frontline treatment for certain mental health disorders?
I think it'll be more frontline than frontline treatment. So what happened at the beginning of this whole psychedelic renaissance is MAPS and other organizations who were initially pushing psychedelics through clinical trials went for the treatment-resistant populations. So it was a much more palatable story for regulators to say, hey, these people don't have any other options. We understand from your perspective that psychedelics have a risk. There's a reputational risk and a cultural risk, and perhaps some biological risk and psychological risk, but it's worth it here for this treatment-resistant population. So you see MAPS, you see Compass going after the treatment-resistant populations, and then you see other companies with first-generation psychedelics. Now that MAPS and others have paved the way, you see other companies going for the general populations. So major depressive disorder, for example, rather than treatment-resistant depression. So that's kind of been the progression. I think what happens next is you're going to start seeing what is the efficacy of those treatments in the general population out of the highly controlled environment of the clinical trial. So if we see this 67% remission rate in treatment-resistant PTSD hold up, all of a sudden it becomes a conversation about is it ethical to make someone go through 2 courses of treatment for PTSD, which we're pretty much absolutely certain are not going to work, before we then allow them to go through the MDMA therapy? And economically, is it worth the cost to waste your money doing that? So I do expect that those efficacy rates will largely hold up. I don't think we're going to get 67% remission in treatment PTSD in the general population, but I think it will be certainly much higher than the alternative. So at that point, they become frontline treatments. What is also interesting is that there's this concept of value-based care. And so this is something that is kind of making its way into the general, I don't know, the public health space. When people think about healthcare, it's this concept where an insurer will say to a given medical center in a certain geographic region, okay, instead of treating the patients who come in and you billing us for your treatment, we're just going to give you whatever, $10 million, and you are responsible for the healthcare for this number of people. And it creates this risk sharing arrangement where now incentives are much better aligned. And this is just something that's generally recognized as we in general in healthcare have to move in this direction because incentives are so disaligned right now. So what we want to see is rather than people coming in where a problem has compounded and gotten worse and worse, and now requires a $50,000 intervention, now the hospitals are incentivized to prioritize preventative treatment, for example. So overall, the cost of healthcare goes down. So this really requires a fundamental rearrangement of how we do healthcare, but I think there's already this force pushing in that direction. And so it's interesting to think about what happens when you see the statistics of psychedelic efficacy being borne out at the population level. Do people start saying, hey, look, whenever we give someone psychedelic treatments, their symptoms go away right away. They no longer qualify for their mental health diagnosis. And we know that a mental health diagnosis is one of the most predictive factors for other kinds of disease. So things like heart disease, for example. So I think insurers and providers are going to see at the population level these kinds of benefits. And so it's interesting to see maybe psychedelic therapy becomes not only the front line, but maybe something even more than frontline. Maybe it becomes a preventative health aspect. And now you're getting into the intersection of not just healthcare, but psychedelics for the betterment of well people via other recreational wellness religious models.
That was very well said, and I agree with what you're saying. All right, so what are you most excited about when it comes to the future of psychedelic medicine? And the other side of that, is there anything that worries you?
What I'm most excited about is what I was talking about earlier, the implications of using psychedelics as tools to probe the infrastructure of the mind, the way in which psychedelics can reveal how different aspects of consciousness are rendered. So as we see psychedelics used more and more for medical purposes, I think the data that comes out of that and the implications for our understanding of consciousness is the most exciting thing. I think the things I'm most concerned about, I think there are a lot of pitfalls here. Certainly, I think everyone is concerned about a repeat of the 60s. So if the hype and the excitement about psychedelics and their benefits gets ahead of a balanced assessment of risk and benefits and who is an appropriate patient population and proper screening and proper support and proper integration, I think that there will be trouble. I'm somewhat concerned about the whole the legalization aspect and the wellness aspect. I don't personally believe that we should put anyone in a cage for which plant they choose to use. But as we go outside of the medical model to deliver these things, the idea is to certainly improve access, and that's a great goal. But I worry that as you try to go outside of the medical model, are you also are you providing the infrastructure that's necessary to support these things? So I think it'll all work out, but I think that's the pitfall that I watch out for.
And
Okay.
and Dylan, sorry, Adam, we do share some some similar concerns. I think I think I don't hear enough people talk about there's a difference between someone with treatment resistant depression and PTSD getting these types of treatments, and someone who doesn't have those disorders. And it does worry me that people struggling right now with that stuff, they'll see clinical trial results coming out. They see like they see headlines like saying basically magic mushrooms are the next cure for mental illness or whatever. And listen, like, all of us here believe that they have incredible potential to treat these different mental health disorders. But when someone, if you're someone, let's say, with treatment resistant PTSD, and then you go out on your own with a mushroom trip, that could sometimes it makes things worse. I've even read some data on this. So I understand your concern around that. I definitely believe that everyone should have the right to try these, but I do think there needs to be a distinction between the medical and wellness recreation model. But yeah.
Well said, Jake. So this is something I wanted to ask, based on what you were talking about in regards to DMT and mapping out the states of consciousness. So you mentioned the entities, and obviously the entities when it comes to DMT experiences are they're talked about very, very frequently. So will it get, in terms of mapping out, does that mean like where you would be able to tell if somebody sees specific entities that could yield a specific therapeutic benefit, or am I kind of missing the forest for the trees here?
Yeah, we can certainly run the data. I'm skeptical that it would get quite that fine grained. So, do you run into a jester or do you run into an alien? I don't know that has a particular therapeutic impact. I know there's some great work, particularly at Imperial College of London, splitting out the rates of occurrence of different types of entities. And I would suspect that the nature of the interaction with the entity would probably drive some level of therapeutic response. So a friendly entity, a teaching entity versus a trickster entity or an unfriendly entity. That could certainly have an impact. And so, there's no harm in running the numbers and seeing if there's a signal there to be explored in human trials. Maybe other aspects, though, that are relevant. So in DMT, famously, there are different levels of the experience. So people talk about a level that is very much grounded, where they're still in the environment. It's a very low dose. There are interesting visuals, but they're not going to another place. But then there's a level that's commonly called the chrysanthemum. So it's this sort of mandala of color, of moving, rotating color. And then beyond the chrysanthemum, there's often something called the waiting room, where the dose is a little bit higher, but it doesn't get too intense. It's just a place to hang out. You're in a different place, but there aren't necessarily entities. Nothing interesting is going on. There doesn't tend to be a very therapeutic component that comes out of that. And then as you get higher and higher, things get more and more complicated, and it is possible to segment out what those levels are. I think there's some level towards a strong or heavy experience that tends to be associated with very profound spiritual experiences. And so when I look at the data I'm familiar with, don't quote me on this, but I think that more of the therapeutic outcomes tend to be associated with more of the higher dose experiences that are in that range. So I do think there are a lot of interesting ways to subdivide the data, but there's definitely a point of diminishing returns where more nuance isn't necessarily going to show anything. There is a sort of a sci-fi speculation side of things where you map out at a very specific level the parts of the brain that can be activated in concert to induce certain types of experience. So there's some interesting research I'm trying to remember the lab. I think it's Dr. Alex Huth, where they put people in an MRI, and they basically played stories in headphones that the people were wearing, and they would then map at a very precise level in the brain, at the level of millimeters. They subdivided every region of the brain into voxels, and so they would map the time course of the story. And so when the story would mention dog, they would look at the area of the brain that lit up. And so it looks like you can actually map out language or map out concepts throughout the entire human brain. And interestingly, often what you'll see is that the words are in areas of the brain for whose function we already understand. So words about visual descriptions, so stripes, for example, are located near or around the visual cortex. So this is very sci-fi. We're not anywhere near there yet, but it's interesting to speculate how at some point, could you actually design an experience, design a hallucination, or understand the human brain well enough to render very specific virtual reality environments. And so I think we'll get there someday. I don't think we're anywhere close, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, that's cool as hell.
Yeah, that is. Holy crap.
So that's all the questions that I've had. Jake, if you want to ask anything else before we wrap this up, feel free. Are you good?
No, I'm good. This was very informative, and I'm looking forward to putting this out and rewatching it myself, actually.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dylan, so much for coming
Thank
on
you
the
so
show.
much, Dylan. Thank you.
I'd love to have you on again because I feel like there's so much more we can cover that we didn't cover in this interview. If you want to, you have a chance to address the audience, but that's a take it or leave it. You don't have to do it.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate you having me on. Fun conversation. Definitely happy to do it again. I guess people can find me on Twitter at Dillan DiNardo, DILLAN DINARDO. Our website is at mindstate.design. So you can reach out on the website, reach out on Twitter if you want to get in touch. But again, Jake, Adam, thanks so much. This was fun. We will do it again.
And we will also include links in the description of the video if you want to just click on it to get to Dylan's socials and to get the Mindstate Labs website. We'll have links in the description. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and like if you want to. It just helps a ton. We were trying to reach as many people as possible. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this and everyone for watching. Thank you very, very much, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.